April 2025, Philadelphia Chesterton Society Reading Packet, GKC and TS Eliot. Quote, an English critic actually accused Eliot of asking us to believe the unbelievable. What is the sense of calling a thing unbelievable when a man like Eliot already believes it? End quote. GK's Weekly, 1934. On Sense and Sound by G.K. Chesterton, All I Survey, 1933, originally in Illustrated London News, May 30th, 1931. On rereading something I wrote about the most modern poetry, especially touching the ancient riddle of sense and sound, I am not sure that I made myself clear, and as I am not now writing the most modern poetry, I may be allowed to be clear. Clarity will be permissible, or at least pardonable. By the way, if I may mention it in parentheses, does anybody know why it is now the fashion to be very extravagant in poetry and very sober in prose? There are individuals, of course, like Mr. James Joyce or Miss Gertrude Stein, whose prose may be said to be of doubtful sobriety. But some of the ablest of the rising or recently risen authors seem to have something like a dual personality in prose and verse. The prose writing of Mr. Osbert Sitwell is not especially Sitwellian, as the term is applied to his poetry. It is well written, but rather on the old principle that a book well written should be as unobtrusive as a man well dressed. It is in the Sitwellian poesy that the average reader is apt to be startled by strange sights, by woolly roses or hairy clouds. Mr. T.S. Eliot's wildest verses do indeed have rhythm, too much rhythm. Really, as the phrase goes, making the head go round, and suggesting a cozy life in the hollow heart of a cyclone or a whirlpool. But there is nothing of this in his essays, which are rather contained and reticent than otherwise. Indeed, when he does make an epigram, and a very good one, he is so ashamed of it that he hides it in the end of a minute footnote, for fear some critic or other should accuse him of brilliancy. The same is largely true even of Mr. Aldous Huxley, so far as essay writing is concerned. His diaries of real travel are quite sensible and unpretentious, while some of his poems are like imaginary travels in the tropics, almost Negro in their barbaric dance of death. The Victorians, who are accused of primness, had much more all-round extravagance. George Meredith was as perverse and fanciful in prose as in verse, indeed more so. Diana of the Crossways seemed to sit not so much at the crossroads as at the heart of the labyrinth, and the egoist juggled much more deceptively than juggling Jerry. Some of the Browning's friends complained that he was cryptic, not only in prose but in private correspondence. I am not complaining of this new method of making extremes meet. There may be a great deal to be said for it, but perhaps it means some decay of the Victorian naturalness, which was more typical than the Victorian decorum. There is something to be said for Browning and Meredith, if only that they could not help writing like Meredith or Browning. But this, as I say, is all in brackets. The matter I meant to raise concerns sense and sound in poetry, and their relation is much more subtle than even the most insanely subtle of the critics seem to understand. I took the familiar example of a famous line in Milton, which has had that inexplicable fascination so often found in the purely classical style. Oddly enough, it is in the rational lines of Virgil or Milton, much more than in the extra-rational lines either of the Merediths or the Sitwells, that we feel the final mystery of song, the something that instantly gives delight and escapes from definition, the thing of which we say, I cannot tell for the life of me why that is as so good as it is. I cannot tell for the life of me why the line, like Tenerife or Atlas unremoved, is as good as it is. Yet it is perfectly straightforward. It merely mentions a cape and a mountain, and adds the somewhat superfluous information that they are not removed. The only thing I am quite sure about is that the sense depends on the sound, and the sound depends on the sense. It actually would not sound the same if another meaning were expressed by the same sound. It actually would not mean as much if other words expressed the same meaning. It would be easy enough to try the experiment in a rough and ready way. It is obvious that if we wrote, like Beachy Head or Snowdon unremoved, it would not be within 1,000 miles of the thing, though Beachy Head is a cape and Snowdon is a mountain. What is not quite so obvious is that the converse is also true. It might be too lightly inferred that the mere noise of the names is alone majestic. It might be even suggested that the down-rushing dactyl of Tenerife has some faint echo of words like terrible or towering, and that the sound is the secret. But it is not so. Though the alternative experiment might be a little more or elaborate to construct. Let us have a stab at it, as Mr. P.G. Wodehouse's young man said when asked if he would be a reasonable being. Thackeray mentions somewhere in one of his essays that in some old cookery book or book of etiquette he had come on the fact that men in the 18th century drank a wine called Tenerife, apparently an alternative to port or Madeira. Thackeray says, I think that it sounds like having to swallow the Matterhorn, but if it were something quite familiar, like port wine, it would sound like any other detail of the dinner table. As for the word Atlas, we have only to knock out the capital letter, and it means a commonplace work of reference, an ordinary book of maps. Now, suppose somebody were writing a very mild or jog-trot domestic poem in decasyllables, rather like those poems in which Cowper celebrated the tea urn or the cat. And suppose the particular passage explained how somebody's after-dinner table was left in a litter by negligent servants, books and wine and everything in a hugger-mugger. His pipe and napkin like his spectacles, like snuff and toast and pen and ink or books, like Tenerife or Atlas unremoved. It would not make the same noise. It actually would not sound in the ear as a matter of mere acoustics the same. The fact of talking only about two trivial objects would in fact alter the actual import of the sound upon the ear and the nerves. Nobody would be looking for a great sonorous effect, and nobody would find it. The fact that the two objects are mountains, mysterious and remote and legendary mountains, does enter irrevocably into the merely physical process, and it is the largeness of those mountains that fills the lungs and the ear. This being so, I think there are much deeper difficulties than are now generally understood about breaking with the traditions of rhythm. I do not say it should not be done, but I do say that it is doubtful whether those who do it should know what they are doing. If my own original use of this quotation was obscure, I am well aware that the whole problem is one of the deepest of obscurity. But this is more or less what I meant, that I do not think we have got to anything like the bottom of the psychology, we might even say the physiology of poetical effects, and that the old conventions of verse rested upon instincts which are perhaps indestructible, which at least cannot be casually destroyed. It would seem that one growth can grow into another, even if they did originally have separate roots, in such a fashion as to form a single life and a new creation, and that new creation is nonetheless unique because it is now old. It is really beside the mark to talk about experiments which are only explosions, for though explosions ought to be expansions, it is certain, at least, that they are disruptions. I do not object to experiments as such. I willingly agree that Mr. Sitwell has as much right to talk about a hairy cloud as an old poet to talk about a fleecy cloud, as much right to do what he can with the hair of a cloud as the other with the hair of a comet. But something much deeper and more mysterious is involved. The old poets had a power of mixing with their fleecy clouds and hairy comets some ancestral magic of the nature of music, by which even the quaintest of the Cavalier conceits, or the most newly coined of Renaissance Latinisms, came weighted with harmonies and historic richness that prevented them from being crude even when they were new. It seems to me that the new poets do not try to recover that ancient wedding of sound and sense. Some of them seem to have only passed from the old Swinburnian phase of sound, without sense, to the latter phase of nonsense without sound. But even the best of them seem to be seeking a divorce rather than a wedding. On Free Verse by G.K. Chesterton, our notebook for the Illustrated London News, March 18th, 1933. The problem of free verse, like the problem of the African race in the American Republic, seems to be rather more problematic after has been freed than it was before it was freed. Seems more rather problematic after it has been freed than before it was freed. Anybody can print as much free verse as he likes without being out of fashion or even against convention, and yet the thing has never become quite normal, even if it becomes universal. There remains a puzzle about exactly how far a more regular rhythm was a harmony or a restraint, which makes every scrap of verse without meter or rhyme turn into a sort of riddle. And a riddle, we may remark, generally did sound most mystical and alluring when it was in meter and rhyme. The primary case for free verse was always fair enough, so far as it went. There certainly are verbal rhythms which are not exactly those of any classical meter, but which do produce an effect which is not merely that of prose, but rather a sort of chant or incantation. There are a great many in the English translation of the Bible. "O my son Absalom, O Absalom my son." Or ever the silver cord be loosed and the golden bowl is broken, and the pitcher is broken at the fountain, and the wheel is broken at the cistern. The interweaving of the word broken is itself an unbroken pattern, and the same fine effect has sometimes been produced in modern free verse. I know one passage in a poem of Mr. T.S. Eliot which begins, I think, "Pray for Rinaldo, avid of speed and power," which might really satisfy the most classical critic who was avid of speed and power. But I have read other poems of T.S. Eliot in which I cannot perceive any rhythm or direction at all, certainly nothing which he, being a cultivated and versatile man, could not have expressed better in classic verse or classic prose. I happened to have before me in the Argosy magazine I have just opened a poem by the late D.H. Lawrence, about whom so many people seem suddenly and simultaneously moved to write books and articles. But I am not going to write an article about D.H. Lawrence, but only about the particular form he chose for his particular poem. It does not raise any of the disturbing questions about Lawrence about which so many of his friends and foes seem to be disturbed. There are certain ethical controversies in which I should believe myself to be on the side of civilization, and which I think he would quite honestly avow himself on the side of barbarism. But those questions do not arise here. Even those who would most indignantly declare that what I call barbarism was a beneficent revolution would not pretend that this poem is at all revolutionary. Its theme is one of the very oldest themes, even of the very oldest poets. It is the glory of the Homeric age, which must have been glorified in pretty nearly every age since the Homeric age. It is that never-failing freshness that seems to lie upon the glittering Greek islands and the first myths of our culture. There is nothing revolutionary about it, unless writing free verse is still revolutionary. And I only wish to inquire in a friendly spirit whether what writing free verse is really an assistance to writing good verse. I am not calling in the question the powers of the poet. I am simply asking whether the same poet would have produced the same poem, or a better or a worse poem, if he had chosen to write it in the traditional forms of poetry. In other words, I would take this one piece of free verse merely as a test of how much verse does gain or lose by being what is called free. It is only a sort of parlor game, but it is a problem that happens to amuse me. First of all, let us take the free verse poem as it stands. It is called the Argonauts. They are not dead, they are not dead. Now that the sun, like a lion, licks his paws and goes slowly down the hill. Now that the moon, who remembers and only cares that we should be lovely in the flesh, with bright crescent feet, pauses near the crest of the hill, climbing slowly like a queen, looking down on the lion as he retreats. Now the sea is the Argonauts' sea. I cannot quote the whole, but it seems with a sharp command not to bring the coffee or pane grill till the ships of Odysseus have sailed past. I'm sorry, I cannot quote the whole, but it ends with a sharp command not to bring the coffee or the pane grill till the ships of Odysseus have sailed past. Now, I hope I shall not be misunderstood if I say that the first impression I have is that while this mode of utterance has become free verse, it has not become free poetry. I mean that it has not produced any purely poetical effect that is freer or wilder or more elemental, magical, or hitherto uncaptured than Shelley or Swinburne or any good poet has produced in formal poetry. It is more conversational. It is not more primeval or even more barbaric. It is more like talk, but not more like tempests loosened or passions made alive. It seems to me, I confess, that the actual effect of the feeling of liberty is even a certain limpness. As he retreats is a weaker ending than so able a writer could have put into a sonnet. The only phrase that claims to be original looks oddly artificial. It is not merely the literal logical point that the sun is seldom observed to lick its paws. It is that the image does not really suit the lion any more than the sun, certainly not the lion taken as a noble symbol of the sun. It has no imaginative fitness. Licking the paws could only remind us that the lion is like the pussycat on the hearthrug, the last thing we want to think when he represents the archaic energy of the sun god. It looks to me as if Lawrence, writing in the spirit of an ancient poem, unconsciously felt he must put in something to show he was a modern poet. But does the freer form really give him a chance of stronger effects? I doubt it. Suppose he had chosen to write the same thought in unfree verse, as so clever a man could doubtless have done much better than I can, but suppose he had begun something like this. They are not dead, the sun like a golden lion goes down to that red desert where he dies. The moon that is bare of all but bodily beauty, the moon that is careless of all but bodily beauty, looks down on the dying lion from the skies, the sea of the Argo, great Odysseus, etc. I only give this, of course, as a very ordinary sample of the classical or even rhetorical verse which any educated man could write. I am concerned wholly with the enquiry of whether this old style is not really rather stronger than the new style. Many great men have written in the new style and believed it would be stronger. Easily written, loose-fingered chords, said Walt Whitman. I feel the thrum of your climax and close. But that is exactly what I do not do. I do not feel that As He Retreats is the best that Lawrence could do for a climax and close. A stronger sense of the rolling sea of the Argonauts comes over me with the long rolling line of the Atalanta. From the Acrosaronian hills to the ford of the Fleece of Gold. I merely propound this as the practical problem of free verse, of whether the freedom really does tend to liberty or only to laxity. I fancy the poet here fell between two stools, between the classic tripod of Delphi and the prosaic wooden stool that Puck pulled from under the old woman, the type of the more modern spirit of abrupt bathos and the grotesque. I am very fond of the grotesque, and in some ways I much prefer Puck to Apollo. But strictly as a critical problem, I doubt whether the modern manner does make better creative poetry in a description of the tall ships of Ulysses going by the isles of Greece. Introductory Note and an Apology for Buffoons by G.K. Chesterton, The Well in the Shallows, 1935. I was monstrously attracted by a suggestion that these essays should bear the general title of Joking Apart. It seemed to me a simple and sensible way of saying that the reader of these pages must not look for many jokes, certainly not merely for jokes. Because these are controversial essays covering all subjects on which a controversialist is challenged, and not particularly subjects chosen as they are chosen by an essayist. It is an awful revelation of the world of unreason into which we have wandered, that people more practical than I are convinced that if I say that this is apart from joking, everyone will think that it is a joke. To my simple mind, it seems very much as if I wanted to call a book Away from Jericho, and everybody assumed that I had accepted a very general recommendation to go to Jericho. Many essays could be written on this strange modern sensibility to mere verbal allusion, or the introduction of certain words, even to repudiate them. But the only point here involved is that these essays are all under the conditions of controversy, which involve the absolute necessity of disgusting those with whom we disagree on any subject, and boring those who are indifferent to that subject. I have had, if I may say so, a very happy and lucky literary life. I have often felt rather the indulgence than the impatience of critics, and it is in a perfectly amiable spirit that I note that it has involved a certain transition or change. Up to a certain point, I was charitably chafed for saying that I could not possibly mean, and I was then rather more sharply criticized when it was discovered that I really did mean it. Now, anybody driven to the defense of what he really does mean must cover all the strategic field of the fight, and must fight at many points which he would not have chosen in fancy, but only in relation to fact. He cannot hope to deal only with heresies that amuse him. He must, in common fairness, deal seriously with heresies that bore him. He must settle down to stating his real reasons for contradicting real statements, which are not made by him as statements, and not chosen by him as subjects. All this seems to me, with my mild rationalistic mind, excellently summarized in the words, joking apart. Anyhow, this is why I have opened this series with an essay called An Apology for Buffoons, because it is in some sense, I will not say a swan song, that ornithological metaphor would not occur to me in relation to myself, but at least a sort of summary of my more frivolous mode of writing, and all that I still think may be fairly advanced for it. Unfortunately, a man fighting what he honestly believes to be false can hardly preserve the glorious immunity of a buffoon. He is forced to be serious, and even those who despise him most are driven desperately to take him seriously. But there is one other reason for adding this preliminary note in connection with the preliminary essay. Since I wrote it, I have come to appreciate much more warmly the admirable work of Mr. T.S. Eliot, and I should like to offer an apology to him for some errors that occurred accidentally in the article itself. It was not he, but another critic with whom I confused him, who made the particular point against alliteration, and the quotation from him was made from memory, and I have not been able to trace it so as to reproduce the exact order of the words. The inaccuracy, if any, does not affect the argument, but the article which I have already planned to put on the same magazine called An Apology to T.S. Eliot would have gone far beyond any such verbal point. It would be an adding impudence to injury to dedicate a book to an author merely on the claim of having misquoted him. But I should be proud to dedicate this book to T.S. Eliot and the return of true logic and a luminous tradition to the world. There was a time when I appeared in the Mercury covered with blushes to acknowledge a friendly criticism which asked if my journalism held enough of the autobiography, and I attempted with great embarrassment to give thanks for the criticism and the compliment. My blush has faded, my sense of decency has departed, and I appear now with the shameless purpose of being not merely autobiographical, but grotesquely egotistical. In a spirit of blazing contradiction, I even propose to be egotistical in disproving the charge of egotism. Nay, in a yet wilder illogicality, I claim to be egotistical in the interests of other people. It is a contradiction in terms, but as the higher mathematics, the higher morality, the higher religion, and the rest now entirely consists in contradictions in terms, I go on with a ghastly calm. And I do it because I cannot think of any other way of drawing attention to the real problem of literature, and especially of popular literature, if I may dare to dream of that contradiction also, except this particular line of argument, which inevitably involves the mention of my own case. Let us hope along with more amusing ones. It is commonly alleged of writers that they resent mild criticisms as infamous personal amputations, taking them as seriously as slanders. Without affectation, I fancy my own case to be rather different and even opposite. Most of the adverse criticisms written about me strike me as quite true. Where I am in invincible ignorance, I suppose, is in a proper sense the importance of the things thus rightly reproved. For instance, a very sympathetic reviewer said that I used too much alliteration, and quoted Mr. T.S. Eliot as saying that such a style maddened him to the point of unendurance, And a similar criticism of my English was made, I think, by another American writer, Mr. Cuthbert Wright. Now I think, on fair consideration, that it is perfectly true that I do use a great deal too much alliteration. The one question on which these gentlemen and I would probably differ is a question of degree, a question of the exact importance or necessity of avoiding alliteration, for I do strongly maintain that it is a question of avoiding alliteration, and even that phrase does not avoid it. And an English writer does not avoid it. He is perpetually dragged into it when he's speaking rapidly or writing a great deal, by the whole trend and current of the English speech. Perhaps that is why the Anglo-Saxon poetry, even down to Piers Plowman, which I enjoy hugely, was an alliteration. And anyhow, the tendency in popular and unconscious speech is quite obvious, in phrases and proverbs and rhymes and catchwords and in 1,000 things. Time and tide, wind and water, fire and flood, waste not, want not, bag and baggage, spick and span, black and blue, deaf and dumb, the devil in the deep sea. When the wine is in, the wit is out, in for a penny, in for a pound, a pig and a poke, a bee and a bonnet, a bat and a belfry, and so on, a myriad of fantastic changes of popular imagery. What elaborate art, what sleepless, cunning even, must these more refined writers employ to dodge this rush of coincidences and run between the drops of this deluge? It must be a terrible strain on the presence of mind to be always ready with a synonym. I can imagine Mr. T.S. Eliot just stopping himself in time and saying with a refined cough, "Waste not, require not." I like to think of Mr. Cuthbert Wright in some headlong moment of American hustle still having the self-control to cry, "Time and fluctuation wait for no man." I can imagine his delicate accent when speaking of a pig in a receptacle or of bats in the campanile. It is a little difficult, perhaps, to imagine the latter critic apparently confining himself to the isolated statement, "Mr. Smith is spick," while his mind hovered in momentary hesitation about how to vary the corresponding truth that Mr. Smith is span. But it is quite easy to conceive an advanced modern artist of this school looking for some sharp and graphic variation in the old color scheme of black and blue. Indeed, we might almost invent a sort of color test, like that which somebody suggested about red grass and green sky, as a test of different schools of painting. We might suggest that the decadents beat people black and yellow, futurists beat them black and orange, neo-Victorians beat them black and magenta, but all recoil from the vulgar alliteration of beating them black and blue. Nor indeed is the reference to these new and varied styles irrelevant. Some of the more bizarre modern methods seem to me to make it rather difficult to have any fixed criticism at all, either of their style or mine. Take, for instance, the case of Mr. T.S. Eliot himself. I recently saw a poem of his praised very highly and doubtless very rightly, though to some extent it seemed because it was a poem of profound disillusionment and melancholy. But the passage specifically quoted for commendation ran, if I remember right, "The smell of steak in passages." That quote is enough to indicate the difficulty I mean, for even the style of this severe and classic sort is after all to some extent a matter of taste. It is not a subject for these extreme controversial passions. If I were to say that the style of that line maddened me to the point of an endurance, I should be greatly exaggerating its effect on the emotions. I should not like even to be written in that style. I should not like everything to be written in that style. I should not like to wander forever in passages stuffy with steak. There we go again. But I cannot think these questions of style are quite so important as these pure stylists suppose. We must be moderate in our reactions, as in that verse especially headed "The Author's Moderation" in the Bab Ballad about Pasha Bailey Ben, another great poem written in a tone of melancholy disillusion. To say that Bailey opened his eyes would feebly paint his great surprise. To say it almost made him die would be to paint it much too high. I may be allowed to open my eyes for a moment at some of the literary models thus commended to me, but I shall soon close them again in healthful slumber. And when the more refined critic implies that my own manner of writing almost makes him die, I think he overestimates my power over life and death. But I have begun with this personal example of alliteration because a question like that of alliteration is not so simple as it looks, and the answer to it applies to much more important things than my own journalistic habits. Alliteration is an example of a thing much easier to condemn in theory than in practice. There are, of course, many famous examples in which an exaggerated alliteration seems quite wrong, and yet those are exactly the examples which it would be most difficult for anybody to put right. Byron, a splendid example of the sort of writer who does not bother much about avoiding anything, did not hesitate to say of his hero at Quatre Bras that he rushed into the field and foremost fighting fell. That is so extreme that we might well suppose it described the end of the life of the adventures of Peter Piper. But I will trouble anybody to alter one word in the line so as to make it better, or even so as to make it make sense. Byron used those words because they were the right words, and you cannot alter them without deliberately choosing the wrong words. This is more often the case in connection with alliteration than many people imagine. I do not mean to claim any such exalted company when I say that on this particular point of conduct I agree with Byron. But Byron does not stand alone. Coleridge, a person of some culture, could burst out boisterously and without stopping for breath. The fair breeze blew, the white foam flew, the furrow followed free. And I do not see that he couldn't have done anything else. I do not think anybody could interfere with the foaming spate of F's, as if the verse that followed was really to follow free. There is a problem behind all this, which is also illustrated in other ways. It is illustrated in the other much controverted question of puns. I know all about the judgments regularly cited as if from dusty law books in the matter. I know all about the story that Dr. Johnson said the man who would make a pun would pick a pocket. How unlucky that lexicographer and guardian of our language in the very act of purging himself of puns should have plunged so shamelessly deep into the mire of alliteration. His example in that very instance would alone be enough to prove the first part of my case, even when it is brought forward against the second. Johnson spluttered out all those P's because he was an Englishman and with a sense of spirit and vigor of the English language, and not a timid prig who had to mind his P's and Q's by using them in exact alternation with a pattern. But if it came to the old joke of invoking authorities, it would be equally easy to invoke even greater authorities on the side of the pun. Also, there is something that is more important to my purpose here. It would not only be easy to quote the puns of the poets, it would be easy to quote the very bad puns of the very good poets. But the question I wish to ask is wider and more essential than all this hodgepodge of snobbery and legalism and 100 familiar quotations which goes to make up the modern invocation of authorities. I wish to point out that there is a general attitude of mind which is defensible, or rather two attitudes of mind which are both defensible. It is a question of style, but here are two different styles, because there are two different motives. If one is now criticizing the other, I do not merely wish to retort the criticism, but rather to proclaim liberty for both. It might be roughly suggested thus: it is not merely a question of a man who makes a pun. We might almost ask, what is to happen to a man who meets a pun? Is he to cut it dead? Is he always to pass by on the other side? Is he to disown such a disreputable company, as of course our refined stylist would do? I am presupposing that he is not out hunting for puns or similar monsters. I presuppose that he is walking down the street on some legitimate business of his own, but if the grotesque animal actually comes to meet him, if it stands obviously in his path, I think it is natural for him to take it in stride. At least it is natural to one sort of man engaged in one sort of business, and it is the man and the business that I am here concerned to defend. This is quite a different sort of question from the elaborate construction of such fireworks as a form of art for art's sake. The many men of genius, Hood, for example, have occupied themselves even with that. But I am not talking about that. When I was a Pauline, an assistant master an assistant master received a testimony on leaving the school for a fellowship at Peterhouse. The solemn upper master made on this occasion the first and last joke of his life by observing in a deep voice, "We are robbing Paul to pay Peter." An old schoolfellow of mine, now a journalist, but cynical even at that early age, declared that the old master must have engineered the whole career of the younger and made him a teacher at that particular school and then a don at that particular college, solely in order to enjoy that one moment of supreme triumph in making that single pun. It is not in the sense of such a triumph of engineering that I am here apologizing for the pun. I am not speaking of the man whose life's purpose, or even whose I'm not speaking of the man's whose life purpose, or even whose purpose is to make a pun, but of the man who is ready to make puns to save his purpose. And there is a whole atmosphere and appetite involved here, which we may call, if we like, the spirit of the demagogue, or of the buffoon, or of the popular minstrel, or of the orator, but which cannot be understood merely in terms of style as style, any more than of art for art's sake. In any case, things of this sort do exist, coincidence or combinations like alliteration or punning, repetitions or conjunctions that have in prose something of the effect of rhyme in poetry. The only question is how to deal with them when they offer themselves very obviously, as they often do. There are, I think, in general view, 3 different ways of dealing with them. First, a man may reject them consciously, as the stylist of the serious school of Mr. Wright does when he speaks of wind and H2O, or instinctively writes in for a penny and in for a treasury note of the value of 20 shillings. I do not say that these examples are taken from the text, but it is quite a mistake to suppose that such fastidiousness is not a real literary problem. I remember a critic pointing out, even in a master of direct and telling English as Mr. E. Housman, a case in which the poet had obviously written the chestnut caster flambeau, simply and solely to avoid writing the chestnut caster candles, which is 20 times better in every possible way. Second, he can accept them consciously, as I very often do, largely because it is not worth the trouble to reject them. I said a moment ago, disown disreputable company, because I do not propose to search in the dictionary for an unnatural alternative to disown. Thirdly, he may accept them unconsciously, and that is a great deal more dangerous than anything else, and a great deal more common than most people imagine. Nobody has yet made an adequate study of the effect of mere phonetics in confusing logic and misleading philosophers, and the worst of that sort of danger is that it is deep and subtle. To decorate an argument with puns and verbal tricks may be a superficial folly, but it is better than the sort of folly that is not superficial. I am almost certain that many moderns suffer from what it may be called the disease of the suppressed pun. I mean that in men who would disdain to make anything so vulgar as a joke out of a verbal coincidence, there is a subconscious movement of the mind to meet the sound of the word. Thus those who would denounce creeds, a Latin word for anything that anybody believes, are seldom or never, you will notice, moved to describe them by any milder name. They must have a word that sounds like a portmanteau of crank and 11 crabbed and greed. They cannot really let themselves go in reviling doctrine. It must be in reviling dogma. They would never sink so low as to make a positive pun about it, as might some poor popish buffoon like Erasmus or Crashaw. They would not say of the Dominicans, the dogs of God are always dogmatic, but they are in fact affecting all this time by a vague verbal association between a dog and a mad dog. It is the accidental sound of the word that makes them use it so incessantly and so monotonously in preference to all other terms, even terms of abuse. On rereading the end of Stevenson's not consciously unsympathetic sketch of the Trappists in The Travels with a Donkey, I could swear that he was involuntarily influenced by the suggestion that the Trappists are caught in a trap. He cries out like one who has escaped that he thanks heaven he is free to hope, to wander, and to love. The logic of it would suggest that somebody had been trying to capture and imprison him, a notion which would certainly have surprised the monks very much. He seems to forget that they also were free to wander, to love, and to do anything they liked, including going into a monastery, and that they had gone into the monastery exactly as he had gone into the mountains. Suppose some burgess of Balaam had contemplating the wanderer in the Savinas, had said, "Thank heaven I am free to dine properly, sit in an armchair, and sleep in a bed." Stevenson might have replied that he was also free to do these things, but preferred to do something else. But he never saw the parallel between the journey to the mountain and the journey to the monastery. And the terror of the old words and traditional associations choked him like a nursery nightmare, and I believe he quailed inwardly at the terrible pun of La Trappe. Now, I, for one, greatly prefer the sort of frivolity that is thrown to the surface like froth, to the sort of frivolity that festers under the surface like slime. To pelt an enemy with a foolish pun or so will never do him any grave injustice. The firework is obviously a firework and not a deadly fire. It may be playing to the gallery, but even the gallery knows it is only playing. But to associate an enemy always with certain ugly-sounding words, and never with their logical synonyms that sound a little better, is in a very real sense to poison our own minds. And that is the case with the man who is subconsciously moved by the sound of words, without realizing that the very assonance is a sort of pun. He must describe a socialist as a Bolshevist because the word Bolshi has a certain savor of Boshi. He must refer to a liberai as a radical because there is a hard sound about rads as there is about cads. It is a sound heard in many English names for foreigners from the time that we first talked about rapparees to the time when we began more faintly to talk about Yankees. The criticism of these foreigners is not in question, but the point is this. If a man can say about a Yankee what he would hardly say it about an American, or even about a North American, then he is allowing this shadow of a pun or sound of a word to spoil his sense of justice and reality. He is obscurely confusing the word yank with the word swank. If he can speak of a froggy more scornfully than he could really speak of a Frenchman, then he is being verbally affected by the word frog, as was the other man by the word dog. I do not think it matters how much we play about with these puns or rhymes or resemblance or echoes of sound, so long as we are obviously doing it on the surface for the sake of the sound. Exactly when this sort of style becomes dangerous to the sense is when it is concealed, as these more sensitive stylists would conceal it. It is so that class consciousness is worse than ever when it is subclass subconsciousness. It is so that the professed impartiality of certain academic historians stinks with their buried prejudice. Compared with this, I do think there is something sporting about conscious buffoonery. As it is embarrassing to use the egotistic example, I will take the example of a much more distinguished person who is in this respect of the same type or temper as I mean Mr. Bernard Shaw. There used to be at one time a great fashion of arguing about Shaw and Shakespeare, and by the way, that must surely have been an artificial trick of alliteration. Yet it would be dangerous to suggest to Shaw that he copied Shakespeare, and there are difficulties even in telling Shakespeare he copied Shaw. Anyhow, one of the few things in which there is a real resemblance between Shaw and Shakespeare is this, that they both seemed very often to make jokes that are not worth making. When Polonius says he was Julius Caesar, whom Brutus killed in the Capitol, and Hamlet is made to answer, "It was a brute part of him to kill so capital a calf there." I do not imagine Shakespeare any more than anybody else thought that those two puns were the most perfect and pointed specimens of wit, but he did think it vital to the story that Hamlet should make a flippant remark of some sort at that moment, and he thought it a very probable sort of flippant remark for him to make. But there are any number of flippancies in Shaw's plays that are no better than this, and serve no other purpose than this. But the point is that flippancies of this sort are only used by a very serious person, and Mr. Bernard Shaw is a very serious person. He wants to say something. He has something to say. If ever the perfect stylistic critics could find themselves in such a peculiar position, they will discover the nature of these temptations to flippancy. It is not an idle contradiction to say that Mr. Shaw is flippant because he is serious. A man like Shaw has the deliberate intention of getting people to listen to what he has to say, and therefore he must be amusing. A man who is only amusing himself need not be amusing. Generally, when he is a perfect and polished stylist, he is not. And there is a good deal of misunderstanding about the relative moral attitude of the two types, especially in connection with the old morality of modesty. Most persons listening to these loud flippancies would say that Bernard Shaw is egotistical. Mr. Bernard Shaw would himself emphatically and violently assert that he is egotistical, and I should emphatically and violently assert that he is not. It is not the first time we have somewhat tartly disagreed, and perhaps I should more effectively perform the just and necessary public duty of annoying Mr. Shaw than by saying, as I do, that in this matter he really inherits an unconscious tradition of Christian humility. The preaching friar puts his sermons into popular language. The missionary fills his sermons with anecdotes and even jokes, because he is thinking of his mission and not of himself. It does not matter that Mr. Shaw's sentences so often begin with the pronoun I. The Apostle Creed begins with the pronoun I, but it goes on to rather more important nouns and names. Father Ronald Knox, in his satire on modernism, has described the courteous vagueness of the Oxford manner, which, tempering pious zeal, corrected, I believe, till one does feel. And though I have much of this courtesy, and though I have much of such courtesy to be thankful for, both in conversation and criticism, I must do justice to the more dogmatic type, where I feel it to be right. And I will say firmly that it is the author who says one does feel who is really an egoist, and the author who says I believe who is not an egoist. We all know what is meant by a truly beautiful essay, and how it is generally written in the light or delicate tone of one does feel. I am perfectly well aware that all my articles are articles, and that none of my articles are essays. An essay is often written in a really graceful and exquisitely balanced style, which I doubt if I could imitate, though I might try. Anyhow, it generally deals with the experience of a certain unprovocative sort in a certain unattached fashion, and it begins something like this. The pond in my garden shows, under the change of morning, an apprehension of the moving air, hardly to be called a wave, and so little clouding its lucidity as to seem rather vacuity in motion. Here at least is nothing to stain the bright negation of water, none of those suburban goldfish that look like carrots, and do but nose after their tails in a circle of frustration, to give some sulky gardener cause to cry stinking fish. The mind is altogether carried away upon the faint curve of wind over water. The movement is something less solid than anything that we can call liquid. The smoke of my light Virginian cigarette does not mount more substantially toward the sky, nor indeed inaptly. It needs some such haven of patriarchal mildness to accent sharply the tang of mild tobacco, alone perhaps of all the attributes of Raleigh's red-haired mistress rightly to be called virginal. I think I might learn to do it some day, though not by a commercial correspondence course. But the truth is that I am very much occupied. I confess to thinking that the things which occupy me are more important, but I am disposed to deny that the thing I think important is myself, and in justice not only to myself, but to Mr. Shaw, Mr. Bullock, and Mr. Mencken, and many other men in the same line of business. I am moved to protest that the other literary method, the method of one does feel, is much more really arrogant than ours. The man in Mr. Shaw's play remarks that who says artist says duelist. Perhaps, nevertheless, Mr. Shaw is too much of a duelist to be quite an artist. But anyhow, I will affirm on the same model that who says essayist says egoist. I am sorry if it is an alliteration, almost a rhyme, and something approaching up to a pun. Like a great many such things, it is also a fact. Even in the fancy example I have given, in 100 far better and more beautiful extracts from the real essays, the point could be shown. If I go out of my way to tell the reader that I smoke Virginian cigarettes, it can only be because I assume that the reader is to be interested in me. Nobody can be interested in Virginian cigarettes. But if I shout at the reader that I believe in the Virginian cause in the American Civil War, as does the author of the American Heresy, if I thunder as he does that all America is now a ruin and an anarchy because in the great battle the good cause went down, then I am not an egoist. I am only a dogmatist, which seems to be much more generally disliked. The fact that I believe in God may be in all modesty of some human interest, because any man believing in God may affect any other man believing in God. But the fact that I do not believe in goldfish as ornaments in a garden pond cannot be of the slightest interest to anybody on earth unless I assume that people are interested in anything whatever that is connected with me. And that is exactly what the true elegant essayist does assume. I do not say he is wrong. I do not deny that he is also, in another way, represents humanity and uses a sort of artistic fiction or symbol in order to do so. I only say that if it comes to a quarrel about being conceited, he is the far more conceited of the two. The one sort of man deals with big things noisily, and the other with small things quietly. But there is much more of the note of superiority in the man who always treats things smaller than himself than the man who always treats of things greater than himself. The latter at least must be very small if he does not feel that they are greater. Now, the two next steps bring us to the climax of the matter. First, this dogmatist is always something of a demagogue. Second, this demagogue is always something of a buffoon. I am very far from denying that he becomes too much of a demagogue and too much of a buffoon. But he does not do so because he prefers superficial things, but rather because he is concerned with fundamental things. If I may illustrate my meaning by one of those deplorable verbalisms over which we are all lamenting, I would say that it is exactly because he is concerned with fundamentals that he is tempted to tickle the groundlings. He is interested in primary facts, and one of those primary facts is the people. He may make jokes and play to the gallery, but there is something more than a joke for him in the phrase which calls the gallery the gods. I am also a tub thumper, and I exaggerated my meaning a moment ago, in the necessity of defending myself, of defending Mr. Shaw, and most exciting of all, of defending Mr. Shaw against Mr. Shaw. I do not really mean, of course, that the essayist is an egoist in any selfish sense. Nobody, in a word, I imagine, gets more good than I do out of good essays like those of Mr. Max Beerbohm, or Mr. E.V. Lucas, or Mr. Robert Lind. I only asked, in all seriousness, that they should understand the necessities of our sort of self-assertion, as well as recognizing the existence of our own. And I do not ask them to believe that when we try to make our sermons and speeches more or less amusing, it is for the very simple and even modest reason that we do not see why the audience should listen unless it is more or less amused. Our mode of speech is conditioned by the fact that it really is what some have fancifully supposed the function of speech to be, something addressed by somebody to somebody else. It has of necessity all the vices and vulgarities attached to a speech that it really is a speech and not a soliloquy. I have come to the conclusion that this last point is too plain to be understood. Some of the simplest things of human history are now quite invisible to minds that have grown accustomed to subdivision or specialism. Thus, the idea of the vow, one of the first facts about our social foundation, is not disputed or denied. It is simply nibbled out of existence by people who do not know that it exists. It is so with the gesture of the sacrifice, without which man is hardly human, and it is so with the gesture of the speaker or the singer dealing directly with the people. I found a case of this confusion in connection with this point after I had tried to suggest it in an article in the Mercury called "The True Case Against Cliques." A critic in the American Bookman immediately assumed that it was only the old and conventional case against cliques. He had got it into his head that I merely had been grumbling about log rolling, and he said that Aristophanes and Euripides had their cliques and backers like anybody else. It seems to me that American criticism, so far from being merely crude, is rather too traditional. It has a curious conservative way with it and labels things in the manner of a museum. Indeed, I found in the same number a very Victorian article called "Science and Religion," in which these two forces were studied under the representative figures of Charles Darwin and Mr. Moody. Many things have been written about science and religion, but I should not feel myself overwhelmed by the onward rush of a new world which had never considered any science later than Darwin, or any religion better than Moody and Sankey. Many things have also been written against log rolling and literary clannishness, but I did not write anything against them, or indeed anything about them. What I was trying, and I fear rather clumsily, to express was that there is now an entirely new danger in the clique, because it is not merely a clique. It has taken on the character of an interpreter by hypothesis, the interpreter of something unintelligible, and its existence encourages the artist to be unintelligible when it is his whole function to be intelligible. The artist is the man who is more or not less intelligible than other men. It is the mass of men whose feelings remain relatively incomprehensible even to themselves. Aristophanes undoubtedly had his faction, and in that sense his clique, but I gravely doubt whether his audience needed anybody to explain to them that when the dead man said, "May I come to life if I do?" it was a joke and a parody of the phrase, "May I die if I do?" In other words, the jokes of Aristophanes, like the jokes of Bernard Shaw, were good jokes, but they were obvious jokes. There was not normally any question of a new and secretive sense of humor, which only a certain school of aesthetes or critics could understand. The buffoonery of Bernard Shaw is in this respect like the buffoonery of Aristophanes, or if it be difficult to make sure of the conditions in the time of Aristophanes, the element of obviousness is equally obvious in the best jokes of Molière or the best jokes of Dickens. The whole case for buffoons is that jokes ought to be obvious. We may even say that they are not really jokes unless they are obvious. There are, of course, special conditions for the thing called irony, in which it is the joke that somebody does not see the joke, but even there that person is not the audience, or if he is, the irony has failed. But in any case, there is here a joke that the critics cannot apparently see, and a joke which is also something of a tragedy. There is under the surface of all this conspiratorial culture a fantastic notion of new and even disparate psychologies breaking up the brotherhood of the common human mind, incommunicable, or at least without communion between one and another. As Mr. Wells imagined man evolving into two animals, we are really called on to imagine mind breaking up not so much into cliques as into species. The buffoon may make his bad jokes. I myself, who am a very minor buffoon to be mentioned with Mr. Shaw, let alone Aristophanes, do not regularly, and as a matter of business, make a multitude of bad jokes. I do it for reasons connected with the duties of demagogy, and I am not defending it here, but rather something much more important. Buffoons may make bad jokes, but it is quite another thing that a man should make a joke and another man really not know that it is a joke. The first man may think it a good joke and the second a bad joke. That is normal and always has been. In the case above mentioned, my critic and I can embrace and agreeing that it is a bad joke. But if aberration and mystery be so deliberately cultivated, and that the jest of one school is not a jest at all, but only a riddle to another, we are at the beginning of a schism more perilous than any in the past. We are suffering taste to tear men asunder, as they have never been torn asunder by religion or revolution or the wars of the world. And of the times there were other and nobler examples of this direct relation between the Maker and mankind. The orator could make a mob feel like an army of heroes. The prophet or preacher could isolate every soul in a crowd and make each feel immortal. To make what is now called a popular speech, it is indeed necessary to make it only too like what is called an after-dinner speech, to keep our connection with the normal life only by a thin thread of flippancy, but at least the connection is kept, and something remains of what is really the archetypal relation implied in the very existence of the arts. It is not altogether our fault if a chasm has opened in the community of beliefs and social traditions which can only be spanned by the far halloo of the buffoon. The New Bigotry by G.K. Chesterton, G.K.'s Weekly, September 13th, 1934. I noticed with some amusement, both in English and American literature, the rise of a new kind of bigotry. Bigotry does not consist in a man being convinced he is right. That is not bigotry, but sanity. Bigotry consists in a man being convinced that another man must be wrong in everything, because he is wrong in a particular belief, that he must be wrong even in thinking that he honestly believes he is right. The last occasion is one applied most to literature and the ability of literary men, and it is all the more like the old bigotry because it is opposite to it. We all know what used to happen sometimes in the Puritan period, or the more critical classicism of the 18th century. A young idealist poet would write a copy of verses, mostly verses somewhat in this style. Or a rushing waterfall in verdant grove, the languid moonlight throws a light of love. The poet was considered quite respectable. Perhaps the poem was even a prize poem. Then it was discovered that the poet, when slightly drunk, had expressed doubts about the exact date of the book of Habakkuk. There was a terrible scandal. The youth was hurled from his college as an atheist, and then the learned critics went back and looked at his poem with a new darkling and suspicious eye. The rushing waterfall, after all, had a very revolutionary sound and hinted at pantheistic anarchy. The phrase languid moonlight was an appeal to all the most profligate passions. Light of love was a term notoriously of loose significance. Today, it is just the opposite, only equally bigoted. A young idealistic poet, full of the new visions of beauty, writes verses appropriate to such vision as, for instance, a bug house under boogies, belch daybreak backfiring, daylights, a void vomit, steadying legs to stump. And all the young critics know he is all right. He has got cosmic rhythm. He is a regular guy. And then a horrid whisper goes round that he was seen outside a church. The whole horrid truth is soon known. He has admitted to a newspaper man that he believes in God. Then the young critics go back gloomily and stare at his poetry, and strangely enough see for the first time that there was something awfully old-fashioned in saying daylight, when Binks might have said sky blank. And after all, boogies are just the sort of thing people are forced by their bishops to believe in. Some of the worst examples have occurred in England is a strictly correct biography of a man of genius who has recently come to us from America, Mr. TS Eliot. It would be an exaggeration to say that Mr. Eliot was expelled from Harvard for being a high churchman, as Shelley was expelled from Oxford for being an atheist. Mr. Eliot's character was not blasted by religion until later in life, and after he had said all that can be said for modern skepticism and despair. But this makes it all the funnier. An English critic actually accused him of asking us to believe the unbelievable. What is the sense of calling a thing unbelievable when a man like Eliot already believes it? The author of The Wasteland knows all there is to know about skepticism and pessimism. Why not admit that his beliefs are beliefs and go back to a proper criticism of his literature? The Spice of Life by G.K. Chesterton in The Spice of Life, 1966. This essay is from a BBC radio address given by Chesterton only 3 short months before his death, nearly to the day. You can hear a small portion of it broadcast on this link in the reading packet. Forgive me if I begin by enacting the part which I have played at so many dinner parties. I mean the part of the skeleton at the feast. Pardon me if the first few words that reach you resemble a hollow voice from the tomb. For the truth is that the very title of this series makes me feel a little funereal. When I was asked to speak on the Spice of Life, I am sorry to say that the first thought that crossed my perverse and morbid mind was that spices are quite as much associated with death as with life. Corpses, embalmed and preserved, were always swathed amid spices. Mummies, I suppose. I am no Egyptologist to decide the point, but even if they were, you would hardly go sniffing around a mummy in the British Museum, drawing deep breaths and saying, "This is indeed the spice of life." Egypt was almost a civilization organized as a funeral procession. It is hardly an exaggeration to say that the living lived to serve the dead, and yet I suppose that an actual Egyptian walking about alive was in no hurry to be spiced, or take a homelier scene nearer home. Suppose you are chased by a mad bull. We will not debate which animal enjoys more of the spice of life, but both at the moment will give unmistakable signs of life. But the quadruped must wait until he is killed and cut up into cold beef before he can have the pride and privilege of being spiced beef. In short, I want you to remember, first of all, that there has been in history not only the spice of life, but something else that may fairly be called the spice of death. I mention it first because it is a sort of parable, and there are a good many things in the modern world that seem to me to be dead, not to say damned, and yet are considered very spicy. I will not dwell on this morbid parallel. Heaven forbid that I should suggest that some ladies are rather like mummies walking about, with very beautiful faces painted on the mummy cases, or that some young gentlemen going the pace exhibit all the culture and selective subtlety of mad bulls. I am concerned with a much more important question at the back of this one. It seems to me that a great many people, whom I am far from calling mummies or mad bulls, are at this point paying rather too much attention to the spice of life and rather too little attention to life. Do not misunderstand me. I am very fond of spiced beef and all the spices. I always dread that the Puritan reformers will suddenly forbid mustard and pepper as they did malt and hops, on the absurd ground that salt and mustard are as unnecessary as music. But while I resist the suggestion that we must eat beef without mustard, I do recognize that there is now a much deeper and more subtle danger that men may want to eat mustard without beef. I mean that they may lose their appetite for beef and bread and cheese and the broad daylight of life, and depend entirely on spices and condiments. I have even been blamed for defending the spices of life against what is called the simple life. I have been blamed for making myself a champion of beer and Skittles. Fortunately, if I was a champion of Skittles, there was never any danger of my being a champion at Skittles. But I have played ordinary games like Skittles, always badly, but all healthy people will agree that you never enjoy a game till you enjoy being beaten at the game. I have even played golf in Scotland before Arthur Balfour brought it to England, and it became a fashion and then a religion. I have been since inhibited by a difficulty in regarding a game as a religion, and the hard secret of my failure is that I never could quite see the difference between cricket and golf, as I played them when I was a boy in Puss in the Corner, and honeypots as I played them when I was a child. Perhaps those nursery games are now forgotten. Anyhow, I will not reveal what good games they were, lest they should become fashionable. If once they were taken seriously in that most serious world, the world of sport, enormous results will follow. The shops will sell a special slipper for Hunt the Slipper, or a caddy will follow the player with a bag full of 15 different slippers. Honeypots will mean money pots, and there will be a corner in Puss in the Corner. Anyhow, I have enjoyed, like everybody else, those sports and spices of life, but I am more and more convinced that neither in your special spices nor in mine, neither in honeypots nor quart pots, neither in mustard nor in music, nor in any other distraction from life, is the secret we are all seeking, the secret of enjoying life. I am perfectly certain that all our world will end in despair unless there is some way of making the mind itself, the ordinary thought we have at ordinary times, more healthy and more happy than they seem to be just now, to judge by most modern novels and poems. You have to be happy in those quiet moments when you remember that you are alive, not in those noisy moments when you forget. Unless we can learn again to enjoy life, we shall not long enjoy the spices of life. I once read a French fairy tale that expressed exactly what I mean. Never believe that French wit is shallow. It is the shining surface of French irony which is unfathomable. It was about a pessimist poet who decided to drown himself, and as he went down to the river, he gave away his eyes to a blind man, his ears to a deaf man, his legs to a lame man, and so on, up to the moment when the reader was waiting for the splash of his suicide. But the author wrote that this senseless trunk settled itself on the shore and began to experience the joy of living, the joy of being alive. You have to go deep and perhaps to grow old to know how true that story is. If I were to ask myself where and when I have been happiest, I could of course give the obvious answer, as true of me as of everybody else, at some dance or feast of the romantic time of life, at some juvenile triumph of debate, at some sight of beautiful things in strange lands. But it is much more important to remember that I have been intensely and imaginatively happy in the queerest because the quietest places. I have been filled with life from within in a cold waiting room in a deserted railway junction. I have been completely alive, sitting on an iron seat under an ugly lamppost at a third-rate watering place. In short, I have experienced the mere excitement of existence in places that would commonly be called as dull as ditch water. And by the way, is ditch water dull? Naturalists with microscopes have told me that it teems with quiet fun. Even that proverbial phrase will prove that we cannot always trust what is proverbial when it professes to describe what is prosaic. I doubt whether the 15 gushing fountains to be found in your ornamental garden contains creatures so amusing as those the microscope reveals, like the profiles of politicians in caricature, and that is only one example out of 1,000 of the things in daily life we call dull, that are not really so dull after all, and I am confident that there is no future for the modern world unless it can understand that it has not merely to seek what is more and more exciting, but rather the yet more exciting business of discovering the excitement in things that are called dull. What we have to teach the young man of the future is how to enjoy himself. Until he can enjoy himself, he will grow more and more tired of enjoying everything else. What we have to teach him is to amuse himself. At this moment, he is more and more dependent upon anything which he thinks will amuse him, and to judge by the expression of his face, it does not amuse him very much. When we consider what he receives, it is indeed a most significant wonder and wealth and concentration of amusement. He can travel in a racing car almost as quick as a cannonball, and still have his car fitted up with wireless from all the ends of the earth. He can get Vienna and Moscow, he can hear Cairo and Warsaw, and if he cannot see England, through which he happens to be traveling, that is after all a small matter. In a century, no doubt his car will travel like a comet, and his wireless will hear the noises in the moon. But all this does not help him when the car stops, and he has to stand stamping about in a line with nothing to think about. All this does not help him even when the wireless stops, and he has to sit still in a silent car with nothing to talk about. If you consider what are the things poured into him, what are the things he receives, then indeed they are colossal cataracts of things, cosmic Niagaras that have never before poured into any human being are poured into him. But if you consider what comes out of him as a result of all this absorption, the result we have to record is rather serious. In the vast majority of cases, nothing. not even conversation as it used to be. He does not conduct long arguments as young men did when I was young. The first and startling effect of all this noise is silence. Second, when he does have the itch to write or say something, it is always an itch in the sense of an irritation. Everything has its better and baser form, and there is irritation and irritation. There is a great deal of difference between the irritation of Aldous Huxley and the irritation of some nasty little degenerate in a novel by Aldous Huxley. But I honestly do not think I am unfair to the whole trend of the time if I say that it is intellectually irritated, and therefore without that sort of rich repose in the mind which I mean when I say that a man, when he is alone, can be happy because he is alive. For instance, a man of genius of the same generation for whom I have a very special admiration is Mr. TS Eliot. But nobody will deny that there was a sense in which originally even his inspiration was irritation. He began with pure pessimism. He has since found much more finer and more subtle things, but I hardly think he has found repose. And it is just here that I will have the effrontery to distinguish between his generation and mine. It used to be thought impudent for a boy to criticize an old gentleman. It now requires far more sublime impudence for the older man to criticize the younger. Yet I will defend my own idea of the spiritual spice of life against even the spiritual that finds its ordinary life entirely without spice. I know very well that Mr. Eliot described the desolation he found more than the desolation he felt. But I think that the wasteland was at least in a world in which he had wandered. And as I am describing the recent world, I may as well describe it as he has described it in The Hollow Man. Though nobody would describe him as a hollow man, this is the impression of many impressions. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper. Now forgive me if I say, in my old world fashion, that I'm damned if ever I felt like that. I recognize the great realities Mr. Eliot has revealed, but I do not admit this is the deepest reality. I am ready to admit that our generation made too much of romance and comfort, but even when I was uncomfortable, I was more comfortable than that. I was more comfortable on the iron seat. I was more happy in the cold waiting room. I knew the world was perishable and would end, but I did not think it would end with a whimper, but, if anything, with a trump of doom. It is doubtless a grotesque spectacle that the great-grandfathers should still be dancing with indecent gaiety when the young are so grave and sad. But in this matter of the spice of life, I will defend the spiritual appetite of my own age. I will even be so indecently frivolous as to break into song and say to the young pessimists, some sneer, some snigger, some simper, in the youth where we laughed and sang, and they may end with a whimper, but we will end with a bang. Sample of early Eliot, Preludes. The winter evening settles down with smell of steak in passageways. 6 o'clock, the burnt-out ends of smoky days. And now a gusty shower wraps the grimy scraps of withered leaves about your feet, and newspaper from vacant lots. The showers beat on broken blinds and chimney pots, and at the corner of the street a lonely cab horse steams and stamps, and then the lighting of the lamps. The morning comes to consciousness of faint stale smells of beer from the sawdust trampled street, with all its muddy feet that press to early coffee stands, with the other masquerades that time resumes. One thinks of all the hands that are raising dingy shades in 1,000 furnished rooms. You tossed a blanket from the bed, you lay upon your back and waited. You dozed and watched the night revealing the 1,000 sordid images of which your soul was constituted. They flickered against the ceiling, and when all the world came back, and the light crept up between the shutters, and you heard the sparrows in the gutters, you had such a vision of the street, as the street hardly understands, sitting along the bed's edge, where you curled the papers from your hair, or clasped the yellow soles of feet in the palms of both soiled hands. His soul stretched tight across the skies that fade behind a city block, are trampled by insistent feet at 4 and 5 and 6 o'clock, and short square fingers stuffing pipes, and evening newspapers and eyes, assured of certain certainties, the conscience of a blackened street, impatient to assume the world. I am moved by fancies that are curled around these images and cling, the notion of some infinitely gentle, infinitely suffering thing. Wipe your hand across your mouth and laugh. The worlds revolve like ancient women, gathering fuel in vacant lots. The Hollow Men. Mr. Kurtz, he dead. A penny for the old guy. We are the hollow men, we are the stuffed men, leaning together, headpiece filled with straw, alas. Our dried voices, when we whisper together, are quiet and meaningless, as wind in dry grass, or rats' feet over broken glass, are in our dry cellar. Shape without form, shade without color, paralyzed force, gesture without motion. Those who have crossed with direct eyes to death's other kingdom, remember us, if at all, not as lost, violent souls, but only as the hollow men. Eyes I dare not meet in dreams in death's dreamed kingdom. These do not appear. Eyes I dare not meet in dreams in death's dream kingdom. These do not appear. There the eyes are, sunlight on a broken column. There is a tree swinging, then voices are, and the wind singing, more distant and more solemn than a fading star. Let me be no nearer in death's dream kingdom. Let me also wear such deliberate disguises. Rat's coat, crowskin, crossed staves in a field, behaving as the wind behaves, no nearer. Not that final meeting in the twilight kingdom. This is the dead land. This is the cactus land. Here the stone images are raised. Here they receive the supplication of a dead man's hand under the twinkling of a fading star. Is it like this in death's other kingdom, waking alone at the hour when we are trembling with tenderness, lips that would kiss, form prayers to broken stone? The eyes are not here. There are no eyes here. In this valley of dying stars, in this hollow valley, this broken jaw of our lost kingdoms, in this last of meeting places, we grope together and avoid speech, gathering on this bench of the Tumid River, sightless unless the eyes reappear as the perpetual star, multifoliate rose of death's twilight kingdom. The only hope, the hope only of empty men. Here we go round the prickly pear, prickly pear, prickly pear. Here we go round the prickly pear at 5 o'clock in the morning. Between the idea and the reality, between the motion and the act, falls the shadow, for thine is the kingdom. Between the conception and the creation, between the emotion and the repose, falls the shadow. Life is very long. Between the desire and the spasm, between the potency and the existence, between the essence and the descent, falls the shadow. For thine is the kingdom. For thine is, life is. For thine is this is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper. The love song of J. Alfred Prufrock. That begins with something in Italian which I will not read. Let us go then, you and I, when the evening is spread out against the sky, like a patient etherized upon a table. Let us go through certain half-deserted streets, the muttering retreats of restless nights in one-night cheap hotels and sawdust restaurants with oyster shells, streets that follow like a tedious argument of insidious intent, to lead you to an overwhelming question. Oh, do not ask, what is it? Let us go and make our visit. In the room, the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. The yellow fog that rubs its back upon the window panes, the yellow smoke that rubs its muzzle on the window panes, licked its tongue into the corners of the evening, lingered upon the pools that stand in drains, let fall upon its back the soot that falls from chimneys, slipped by the terrace, made a sudden leap, and seeing that it was a soft October night, curled once about the house and fell asleep. And indeed there will be time for the yellow smoke that slides along the street, rubbing its back upon the window panes. There will be time to prepare a face to meet the faces that you meet. There will be time to murmur and create. There will be time to murder and create. And time for all the works and days of hands that lift and drop a question on your plate. Time for you and time for me. Time yet for 100 indecisions and for 100 visions and revisions before the taking of a toast and tea. In the room the women come and go, talking of Michelangelo. And indeed there will be time to wonder, do I dare, and do I dare? Time to turn back and descend the stair with a bald spot in the middle of my hair. They will say, how his hair is growing thin. My morning coat, my collar mounting firmly to the chin, my necktie and modest, rich and modest, but asserted by a simple pin. Shh. They will say, but how his arms and legs are thin. Do I dare disturb the universe? In a minute there is time for decisions and revisions, which a minute will reverse. For I have known them already, known them all, have known the evenings, mornings, afternoons, have measured out my life with coffee spoons. I know the voices dying with a dying fall beneath the music from a farther room. So how should I presume? I have known the eyes already, known them all, the eyes that fix you in a formulated phrase. And when I am formulated sprawling on a pin, when I am pinned and wriggling on the wall, then how should I begin to spit out all the butt ends of my days and ways? And how should I presume? And I have known the arms already, known them all, arms that are braceleted and white and bare, but in the lamplight downed with light brown hair. Is it perfumed from a dress that makes me so digress? Arms that lie along a table or wrap about a shawl, and should I then presume? And how shall I begin? Shall I say I have gone at dusk through narrow streets and watched the smoke that rises from the pipes of lonely men in shirt sleeves leaning out of windows? I should have been a pair of ragged claws scuttling across the floors of silent seas. And the afternoon, the evening sleeps so peacefully, smoothed by long fingers, asleep, tired, or it malingers, stretched on the floor here beside you and me. Should I, after tea and cakes and ices, have the strength to force the moment to its crisis? But though I have wept and fasted, wept and prayed, though I have seen my head grow slightly bald, brought upon a platter, I am no prophet, and here's no greater matter. I have seen the moment of my greatness flicker, and I have seen the eternal footman hold my coat and snicker, and in short I was afraid. And would it have been worth it after all, after the cups, the marmalade, the tea, among the porcelain, among some talk of you and me? Would it have been worthwhile to have bitten off the matter with a smile, to have squeezed the universe into a ball, to roll it towards some overwhelming question, to say, I am Lazarus, come from the dead, come back to yell it, to tell you all, I shall tell you all? If one, settling a pillow by her head, should say, that is not what I meant at all, that is not it at all. And would it have been worth it after all? Would it have been worthwhile after the sunsets and the dooryards and the sprinkled streets and the novels, after the teacups, after the skirts that trail along the floor, and this and so much more? It is impossible to say what I mean, but as if a magic lantern threw the nerves in patterns on a screen, would it have been worthwhile? If one settling a pillow or throwing off a shawl and turning toward the window should say, that is not it at all, that is not what I meant at all. No, I am not Prince Hamlet, nor was meant to be. I am an attendant lord, one that will do, to swell a progress, start a scene or two, advise the prince, no doubt, an easy tool, deferential, glad to be of use, politic, cautious, and meticulous, full of high sentence, but a bit obtuse, at times indeed almost ridiculous, almost at times the fool. I grow old, I shall wear the bottoms of my trousers rolled. Shall I part my hair behind? Do I dare to eat a peach? I shall wear white flannel trousers and walk upon the beach. I have heard the mermaids singing to each other, each to each. I do not think that they will sing to me. I have seen them riding seaward on the waves, combing the white hair of the waves blown back, when the wind blows the water white and black. We have lingered in the chambers of the sea, by sea-girls wreathed in seaweed and red and brown, till human voices wake us, and we drown. From the wasteland, a game of chess. The chair she sat in, like a burnished throne, glowed on the marble where the glass, held up by standards wrought with fruited vines, from which golden cupidan excuse me. From the wasteland, a game of chess. The chair she sat in, like a burnished throne, glowed on the marble where the glass, held up by standards wrought with fruited vines, from which a golden Cupidon peeped out. Another hid his eyes behind his wing, doubled the flames of seven-branched candelabra, reflecting light upon the table as the glittering of her jewels rose to meet it. From satin cases poured in rich profusion in vials of ivory and colored glass, unstoppered, lurked her strange synthetic fumes, ungent, powdered, or liquid, troubled, confused, and drowned in the scents and odors stirred by the air that freshened from the window. These ascended, and fattening the prolonged candle flames, flung their smoke into lacaria, stirring the pattern on the coffered ceiling. Huge seaweed fed with copper, burned green and orange, framed by the colored stone, in which sad light a carved dolphin swam. Above the antique mantel was displayed, as though a window gave upon the sylvan scene, the change of Philomel by the barbarous king, so rudely forced, yet there the nightingale filled all the desert with inviolable voice, and still she cried, and still the world pursues, jug, jug, to dirty ears. And other withered stumps of time were told upon the walls, staring forms, leaned out, leaning, hushing the room enclosed. Footsteps shuffled on the air, under the firelight, under the brush. Her hair, spread out in fiery points, glowed into words, and then would be savagely still. My nerves are bad tonight. Yes, bad. Stay with me. Speak to me. Why do you never speak? Speak. What are you thinking of? What thinking? What? I never know what you're thinking. Think we are all Rats Alley. I think we are in Rats Alley, where the dead men lost their bones. What is that noise? The wind under the door. What is that noise now? What is the wind doing? Nothing again, nothing. Do you know nothing? Do you see nothing? Do you remember nothing? I remember. Those are pearls that were his eyes. Are you alive or not? Is there nothing in your head but, oh, that Shakespearean rag? It's so elegant, so intelligent. What shall I do now? What shall I do? I shall rush out as I am and walk the street with my hair down so. What shall we do tomorrow? What shall we ever do? The hot water at 10. And if it rains, a closed car at 4. And we shall play a game of chess, pressing lidless eyes and waiting for a knock upon the door. When Lil's husband got demobbed, I said, I didn't mince my words. I said to her myself, hurry up, please, it's time. Now Albert's come back. Make yourself a bit smart. He'll want to know what you done with that money he gave you. To get yourself some teeth, he did. I was there. You'll have them all out, Lil, and get a nice set. He said, I swear I can't bear to look at you. Ain't no more, can't I said, and think of poor Albert. He's been in the army 4 years. He wants a good time. And if you don't give it him, there's others will, I said. Oh, is there, she said. Something of that, I said. Then I'll know who to thank, she said, and give me a straight look. Hurry up, please, it's time. If you don't like it, you can get on with it, I said. Others can pick and choose if you can't. But if Alfred makes off, it won't be for lack of telling. You ought to be ashamed, I said, to look so antique. And her only 31. I can't help it, she said, pulling a long face. It's them pills I took to bring it off, she said. She's had 5 already and nearly died of young George. The chemist said it would be all right, but I've never been the same. You're a proper fool, I said. Well, if Albert won't leave me alone, there it is, I said. What you get married for if you don't want children? Hurry up, please, it's time. Well, that Sunday Albert was home, they had a hot gammon, and they asked me to dinner to get the beauty of it hot. Hurry up, please, it's time. Hurry up, please, it's time. Good night, Bill. Good night, Lou. Good night, May. Good night. Ta-ta. Good night, good night. Good night, ladies. Good night. Sweet ladies, good night. Good night.